guys, today we're going to be doing a tag video, which I feel like I have not done a tag in months. Like, it's been such a long time, and I love doing tag videos because I just like to sit down and talk and answer questions. So today's tag is a tag that has been floating around for a very long time, and this is not the palette tag that Samantha March came up with. This is another palette tag. So this is the palette tag created by a Swedish YouTuber called Angelica Lyremar. I would guess that she would pronounce it Angelica Lyremar or something like that. My Swedish is not the best, so if I were to say Angelica in Norwegian, it would be Angelica. So like, it's like 3 different pronunciations, but you get what I mean. I will have her channel listed down below in my description box. She is awesome. I am subscribed to her and I watch quite a few of her videos. So let's just go ahead and get into the questions because I love talking about palettes, and clearly you guys like to hear me talk about palettes because these videos always do really well. So let's just go ahead and get into it. First question is, what is a palette that I regret not buying? So most of the people that I've said answer this questions, they have said like limited editions palette that are no longer available, but I'm actually going to say a palette that is still available. But I always look at these things from like a YouTuber standpoint. So I have a rule for myself that I do not buy old palettes because it's just not, I just don't have the time to enjoy them enough off camera to be able to justify paying the price for something that I probably will not be making videos with. And if I do make videos with older palettes, they just don't do that well. And with everything that I buy and everything I review, I simply just don't really have enough time to put older palettes into the mix with the videos that I make. So the palette that I really wish I bought when it came out is the Norvina 2 palette. That palette is just so stinking beautiful, and I've said this in the past too. I don't know what happened that made me not buy that palette, because that palette is literally me in a palette. It is on the bigger side, which I don't love, and I think the reason I didn't end up buying it is because I just didn't feel like I had the time at the moment to really be able to review that palette properly. Because if I'm gonna review a palette that big, like I need to do more than 3 looks with it. Like that's just not enough, and I just felt like it would be too much work at the time of that palette being released, so I never ended up buying it, and now it's just kind of too late for me. So it sucks, and like, yes, I know so many of you are gonna be like, well, you can just buy it, or like it's on sale, or you know, but it's a rule that I have for myself, and it's something that really helps me not overspend on makeup and not spend more money than I need to, but still being able to be a review channel, if that makes sense. So I just can't go back and like buy older releases unless it's a very specific situation, which just doesn't really come up that often. So that is a palette that I do wish I had in my collection. I wish it came out at a different time because the color story in that palette is literally perfect for me. Next question is, what is a palette that I regret buying or you regret buying? What is a palette that I regret buying? So the palette that I regret buying is a palette that I regret now, but at the time I didn't regret it. But I didn't really know like what my real aesthetic was, or whatever you want to call it back then. I bought this before I started my channel, and this is the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. I'm sure you've all seen this palette, and looking at this and you looking at me and like knowing me, you totally understand why I regret buying this palette, because these shades are just, they're just not my thing. I mean, I don't know. I had good intentions when I bought this, and I really thought that I would get a lot of use out of it, but learning that I'm just not really into neutrals a lot, I never used this palette. I've probably used it like 7 or 8 times maybe, and it's just, I don't know, it sucks because it was an expensive palette and the quality is really good, and I wish that I was into these, but looking at this palette, it just doesn't inspire me in the slightest. So it's one of those things, I'm not going to get rid of it or declutter it because it is expensive and it is a Natasha Denona palette, and I like having this for like references, or just I like having it in my collection just to look at. And you know, I'm just, like I said, I'm just not going to get rid of it even if I don't use it. Next one says, a palette that I haven't used as much as I thought I would. And I had to go through my collection, and again, this is from like a YouTuber standpoint. Like, I usually, when I'm done reviewing something, it's very hard for me to go back to something afterwards unless I absolutely love it. For me to make time to use older palettes, you know, this is kind of what I do. This is my job. This is how I look at eyeshadow palettes, and I know that I'm not relatable in that way because people who buy palettes buy them so that they can use them all the time. I buy a palette, I review the palette, I do the looks that I do with the palette, and then I'm pretty much done with it unless it's like spectacular, and then I can somehow pull it into other videos or, you know, do more things with it. But the palette that I wish I used more is the Sugar Pill Mini Fun Size palette. This is such a cute palette, and I The color story in this is so fun. I remember when I got this, I played with it, I loved it. I said in the video where I used it that like, this would be a great travel palette. This would be amazing to like bring along with something else. I have traveled since then and I didn't bring this palette, and I don't know why, because this palette is the cutest thing ever. The quality is amazing, the colors are amazing. I don't know, I need to pull this into one of my Married at First Sight videos. Maybe let me know if you want to see that. I think that could be kind of fun. Like, this would be a fun palette to do that with. So yeah, this is definitely a palette that I actually thought that I would use more than I have, and I just haven't. Next one is a palette that I use more than I thought I would, and this one is so easy because I bought this thinking I would only do a review on it, but I ended up actually doing a 10-look video with this, which I wasn't planning on at all when I bought it, and this is the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette. Also, because of the color story in this, I really didn't think that I would use it that much. I ended up getting this at Sephora, which is like a convention that was held in LA last year, and this was on sale before it even launched at Sephora, so that is why I ended up picking it up, because I knew I'd be able to get a really quick review up on this. Plus, I was really intrigued by this and I wanted to test it out, but it turns out that this is one of my favorite palettes in my collection somehow. It is just an incredible palette. I've traveled with this, I've used this so often, and I refer to this all the time, and I think that this is a fantastic palette. I don't regret buying this at all. So I'm happy that the palette that I didn't end up regret buying is another Natasha Denona palette, because it makes me feel a little bit better about wasting my money on this one. Next question, what is my favorite half colorful and half neutral palette? It took me quite a while to like come up with the answer on this one, because I wouldn't say I have a lot of half and halves, but I definitely have a few and I like most of them. But the one that really stood out to me is a palette that I really enjoy, and this is the Glamlight Taco palette. So you might look at this and be like, that's not really that neutral, but like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of these colors are quite neutral. Like, there's a brown here, there's a brown there. This kind of muted olivey green is kind of neutral. You have the gold here, kind of like an orange. I mean, the orange isn't really neutral, but you have like some muted down colors. And I do think that like half of this palette could probably be considered neutral for some people, at least for me, but I just love this palette. I love the color story in this palette. I feel like the neutral shades in here, or the more toned down shades, really go with like the rest of the palette. So this would be my pick. I mean, I know there are so many others that I could have chosen for this, but this is just a palette that I really enjoy that does have some browns in it. So that's kind of how I looked at it. Next question. I am ashamed to even show you this because this is a palette that I bought simply because of the packaging. This is a palette that I haven't even used yet, and I have talked about this in my palette collection and declutter video, which has not gone up yet, so if I'm repeating myself, you'll probably hear me say the same thing in that video, but this is the Dandelions & Co. I don't even know what the name of this palette is because honestly it doesn't say on it, but look at this packaging. These are handmade, so he basically stuck all of these flowers on top of this cheap plastic packaging. And I will show you what the palette inside looks like. So here is the palette. Now the reason I haven't used this is because he ended up sending me a single shadow along with this palette, and when I swatched that single shadow, it is the worst shadow that I've ever swatched in my whole life, and now I am so scared of using this. Because I don't want the quality inside of this palette to be the same as the single that he sent me. But I don't know, I bought this because of the packaging, because of the thought that went into it, and I wanted to kind of support a startup brand. I do want to play with this palette, but I'm just scared. I'm just scared I'm not going to like it, just from the experience that I had swatching that one shadow. But if you want to see a video with this, let me know and I can maybe do that, because it is a beautiful palette. Alright, so the next two are interesting. The first one says a palette where I like the shimmers more than I like the mattes. And this one is going to go to one of my newer palettes, and this is the Sample Beauty Prodigy Palette Jewel Tone Edition. You guys probably saw the reviews that I did on these, or the review, I meant the looks that I did with this. And basically what I said is I don't really like the mattes in this, but some of these shimmers, this one, and this one, are spectacular. They look so wet looking and just interesting and dimensional and yummy on the lids, and they're just, they're unlike anything else that I think I have in any palette in my collection. I would say the closest would be some of my Udensai palettes. The shimmers in those are like kind of similar to these, but these shimmers are just out of this world, whereas I found the mattes to be kind of, I don't know, they would fade on me a little bit and they got kind of patchy when I was using them, at least some of them. Some of them are okay, but I will never reach for this palette again for the mattes, because they're not as good as what I have in other palettes. And even though I love the color story in this, they're just not that great. But the shimmers, this palette is worth it for those 3 shimmers alone, because they are in a league of their own, if you want to say that. Next up, we have a palette where you like the mattes more than the shimmers, and this one was pretty easy for me because the first palette that came to my mind is the Menagerie Killer Purr palette. I love Menagerie's mattes. They are some of my favorite mattes in my collection, but the shimmers in this palette are just kind of chunky and flaky and weird and hard to work with, and they're also bronzes, and I don't like bronze shimmers. So I feel like this was a pretty easy choice for me because I don't like either of these 2 shimmers because they're just not really something that I reach for, but I love the mattes in these, and like I said, I love her matte formula. More than I like her shimmers. I have gotten along with her shimmers more now that I have been using my NYX glitter primer. I find that to be really helpful at just getting like a smooth, even application and being able to pick up those shadows with a brush. So if you're struggling maybe with that kind of formula, maybe pick up the NYX glitter primer. I swear to God, like, it has become such a holy grail product for me because I just cannot stop using it. It just works with everything. Next up, we have a palette that happily surprised you. And this one was very easy for me because this is the Impressionism palette by Musée Beauty. They sent me this and I didn't know what to expect at all. I mean, this is the brand's first palette. I was like, sure, I'll try it. I mean, that's what I always say usually if brands want to send me something and I like the color story. I'm like, sure, why not, you know? This is what the palette looks like and this blew me away. The mattes in this are some of the best mattes that I have ever tried, and it's rare for like a very new indie brand to have nailed their matte formula in the way that this brand has. Like, it's just insane. And the shimmers are nice too. The shimmers aren't my favorite. I do like the mattes over the shimmers in this palette, but I do like the shimmers. I just have like such a soft spot for these mattes. I think that they perform so well. They do everything that I want a matte to do. They build, they blend, they're pigmented, they're easy to work with. They're just fantastic. So I was so impressed by this palette, maybe why it's called the Impressionism palette, but I was just so impressed by this, and every time I use it, I have the best time. The color story is amazing. There's absolutely nothing I don't like about this palette, so I'm just really glad to have this in my collection, and I'm happy I was able to test this out. Musée has now said that they do ship to Canada. I know some of you guys were mad that they didn't ship worldwide. I know they don't ship worldwide yet, but they have expanded at least, so if you do live in Canada and you want to get this palette, now you can. So I thought I would just kind of mention it because I know a lot of you want to get this palette. Now, the last question is one that there's so many palettes that I could have picked, and this is a palette with the most unique color story. I actually did a video not that long ago basically showing my most unique color stories in my palettes in my collection. I will link that in the corner if you want to check that out because I mentioned a lot of palettes in that video. But the palette to me that is like the most inspiring and interesting and unique color story in my collection is going to have to be the Sandra Rose palette by Glaminatrix. This palette is just so stunning, and I know I say this every time I show this palette, but I actually helped curate the color story in this palette. It's not a collab or anything, we just kind of, you know, started talking and I ended up helping a little bit, but so I am a little bit biased about this palette, not gonna lie, but like, look at it. Isn't it just so beautiful? Like, the tones in all of these colors are just so different. I don't know how else to say it. Like, none of them are like your basic primary or secondary colors. Like, there's something about the tones in all of these mattes that just makes this palette a little bit different than a lot of other palettes, and I just find that all of these just go so nicely together. I love the combination of pinks and greens together, so I'm all over this palette, and I also just love greens and blues together, so this is so perfect. I think that she did such an amazing job with this, and I'm so glad that I have this. But like I said, if you want to see other palettes that I find to be very unique in my collection, go check out that video because I mentioned a lot of palettes in that video that I didn't mention in this one. So those were all of the questions. This was a really fun tag, and it was kind of fun to like go through my collection and think about all of these, and I love doing eyeshadow palette tags for that reason because, I don't know, there's something about just like going back through the memories of having used all the palettes and just figuring out what it is that I really like about the palettes that I have. I just find that to be really fun. So thank you so much to Angelica for coming up with this tag. I will tag some people down in my description box that I want to see do this that haven't done it already. If you want to see some other tag videos that I have on my channel, here is my tag playlist. And if you're new, I would love it if you would consider subscribing, and I will see you in my next one.